Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second Tech Speakers Masterclass of Winter 2017. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Catt Small, who will be presenting the full story, presenting complete ideas. Catt is a product designer, developer, and game developer at Etsy, where she makes awesome things. She's been programming interactive games since about age 10 and continues ever since. In her spare time, she works with Good for People of Color and launches games with Brooklyn Gamery. Without further ado, Catt Small, thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Yay. Hi, Internet people. So I'm here today to talk about how and why it's good to use storytelling in your presentations. So we're going to be talking about storytelling as a concept, as well as how to use storytelling within your presentations to make better and more engaging talks. But first, just kind of giving a little bit more context about where I'm coming from. So Javi did a great job of introducing me in terms of what I do. I'm a product designer at Etsy, which is a website that lets people buy unique goods from around the world. And I mostly focus on the payments experience for sellers by helping them to understand the payments that they were receiving and also to update their payment preferences. I am also a co-founder of Brooklyn Gamery, where we make endearing and weird video games and organize diversity of focused events like the Game Devs of Color Expo. And I also make my own random things like games, apps, websites, and comics. I've spoken at various events, including TEDx, Beyond Tellerrand, which is a cutting-edge technology conference in Berlin that happens in both Dusseldorf and Berlin, and AIGA Design Conference, which is a conference for designers of all kinds, including print designers as well as user experience designers like myself. At these different places, I've spoken about many different topics because often the conferences don't have very much in common. Sometimes they're about technology, sometimes they're about programming, design, life experience, and so I've had to kind of shake it up a little bit and talk about lots of different things. But all of these different talks that I've done have a singular thing in common at the very least, and that is telling stories. So just to give a brief definition so that we're all on the same page about what storytelling is, I'm going to be referring to it as the social and cultural activity of sharing stories, and that comes from Wikipedia. So just to kind of break down what exactly that means, we've got these three different components that make up a story. We've got plot, we have characters, and point of view, and all of these come together to tell an overarching narrative that hopefully guides you or guides listeners through the process of your talk. So breaking those down and defining those a little bit, the plot refers to the sequence of events that happen in a story, and a story can be long or short, and it can involve many or few events. Additionally, characters are the beings who exist within the story, and by beings I mean any objects that have agency or personality. They affect or are affected by the plot that's happening. So for example, you can have beings who are animals or people or even objects that have been given life, for example, a clicky thing like this. And then finally, you have the point of view, which is the perspective of the narrator. So in this case, it's me because I'm sharing this presentation with you and I'm telling the story in the way that seems best to me. In terms of why storytelling is important and why it matters and why we should all think about ways to tell stories with our talks, firstly, people engage much more. It's more engaging for your listeners. So what I mean by that is that from childhood, we've been primed to listen to stories. We've got fairy tales that we've been told since we were young. These are all ways that we were communicated to. People shared morals and learnings through stories. Additionally, people really, really like the process of a story moving from start to finish. They love the beginning, the middle, the end. They want to know what happens next and how it ends, as I said. So, and even when you know how the story ends, if you see the ending at the beginning, you want to understand, well, how did it get there? So people just really love stories. They also relate more when they're hearing stories, because a lot of people put themselves in the shoes of the characters in those stories and say, oh, this could have happened to me. So they start to feel this sense of compassion for the narrator as well as the characters in the story. And additionally, stories make you feel like an interesting human being. And obviously, we're all real people, but it's about communicating your experiences to other people, or communicating the experiences of others to others. And I really highlight this because when I was younger, I used to be quite bad at storytelling and sharing my experiences with other people. And I found that the most relatable people were those who told stories more and shared more of the things that they were learning with others. And it was because they were vulnerable, they were funny, they were engaging, and people really liked that. So now I make a conscious effort to, within my presentations, but also within my actual regular day-to-day life, just make sure that I share more stories with people. Thirdly, people understand more when you use stories, and this is actually a thing that has been studied. So for example, Marilee Brain Lady Springer wrote an entire piece about this and did several studies on this, and people actually process information better when stories are told to them, basically. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but basically our brains compare existing experiences that they've had with new stories that they learn, and things that are related to their own personal experiences can actually be processed more easily, which means that stories are more likely to be relatable to existing experiences that people have had, or even fears or concerns that people have thought about before. So, for example, if something happens to one person and someone says, oh my God, I was afraid that that thing was going to happen forever, well, now they know exactly where that, like what the result of that is, and they also are very likely to remember possibly the presentation that someone actually conveyed that story within. And there's two different ways to do this. So firstly, you can use analogies, which are kind of like short little tidbits that are hopefully related to down-to-earth things that can be used to explain ideas that are hard to understand. For example, when I was younger, learning JavaScript, how to program JavaScript, I found it really useful to think about functions as in teaching a dog to fetch. And that was because when you teach a dog something for the first time, usually they are able to then just execute upon it repeatedly after the first time you teach it. And obviously it's not a direct correlation, but it helps people understand these kinds of complex things that are maybe kind of scary at first, and it makes it more relatable and more friendly, and hopefully they have a more positive way to actually remember this concept that might be scary for some people. And larger and more personal stories can also be used to explain these larger concepts. For example, how to use different processes in the workplace, or any other thing that maybe requires a little bit more depth. So you can use these larger stories, not analogies, to kind of talk about these more complex things, rather. So for example, by talking about a personal failure or a frustration or even a way that you succeeded, you can transfer your experiences into other people's success, and people really appreciate the opportunity to learn from mistakes and from other people's experiences, because especially, for example, me, I'm like in front of y'all right now, and maybe I seem like everything's going great, but we've all had our ups and downs, and it's very useful to kind of use the platform that I'm using right now, for example, to share the learnings that got me to this point, which is why I'm really happy to be here right now. So thank you. Continuing on, people remember more when you share stories. And I mentioned this before with the entire part about it being a little bit more relatable. But that's, again, related to the brain really enjoying beginnings, middles, and ends. Our brains really like to process things in this story format, and that's probably why I don't like shows that never end. For example, The Simpsons. I need a finished Everyone needs like a finished package. They need a beginning, they need a middle, they need an end, and our brains just really like that. So now that you know what storytelling is within the realm of this talk and why it's super useful for conveying the concepts that you're trying to share with people during presentations, here's a little bit about how to put that extra awesome sparkle into your future talks by using storytelling. And I'm going to be going through my entire process from the beginning to the almost finished product. I'm not going to get too much into the presentation building part because it's about designing the content before you actually build the presentation. So firstly, I'm going to point something out, and I've kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but when you are designing a talk, kind of like stories in general, you have the overarching plot, and then you have the sub-stories or the minor plot points that make up the entire concept that you're trying to drive home. So when I'm talking about these different things, I'm going to talk about creating the overarching story, and then I'm also going to talk about opportunities to actually drive home the points in your talk using these sub-stories, as I will sometimes refer to them. So let's start. So firstly, when I am identifying a talk idea, I usually like to start by fleshing it out by writing an abstract. So what that means is I'm writing a summary of the speech or the presentation that I'm going to give, and this is great because this is usually what conferences ask for anyway, so it's really convenient to send them this piece of information, or maybe you'll have an idea and they will just ask you for an abstract anyway. But when you're actually doing a call for or a proposal, they're usually going to ask for this abstract, so it's great to have this written up anyway. So I usually answer questions like, what is the talk about? What are you trying to solve? What will attendees learn? And the last one is really important because that's what is going to actually drive people to your talk. And also for conference organizers, that's what they're actually going to look for anyway. So you want to make sure that you've identified the talk's audience and made it attractive in some way, hopefully. Like, everyone's biased, so attractive is kind of a weird phrase, but you want to make sure that you're thinking about your end users, which in this case is your audience. And then once I've written this abstract, what I do next is I usually just either start with a blank piece of paper, or I will go into a word processing program like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and I just start mind mapping, which is the process of writing down lots of related ideas to the initial idea that came into your head. So for example, in terms of this talk that I did called Designing Socially Impactful Experiences, I started to write a bunch of things down like, oh, this is how technology succeeds, this is how it fails, this idea of humility, how do I create a project for good, how has technology been used as a silver bullet to kind of solve all problems, and things like that. And then once I just kind of wrote everything down, I start to organize it into a structure that makes a little bit more sense. And this becomes the high-level outline that provides the overall direction for my talk. So taking the previous slide and sort of organizing these pieces of information into sections, you can have the overarching idea of designing socially impactful experiences, but then there's one section that's about how technology has been used in the past and how it's failed and succeeded as this idea of a silver bullet that kind of solves all problems. And then you can also have a section that's more about how to create a project for good with the idea of humility in mind. And then once I've actually kind of organized that stuff a little bit, I transfer that outline into a writing program, if I wasn't already using one like Word, for example. And then I start adding these time budgets or buckets to each section. And what that does is helps me to figure out how much to talk about each part of my presentation. It also helps me figure out how many slides I'm probably going to have to make. And it helps me remember how much time I have overall, because it's very, very easy to go over or go under if you don't start thinking about the time you're going to need pretty early. And then I actually start filling out these sections more once I've figured out how much time I can actually give to each part. And what this does is allow me to start really, again, thinking about the design of the content before I get into the presentation. And that's how I actually did this entire presentation that I'm doing for you right now. And then once I've kind of done this brain dump and organized it all and written it up, I start thinking about spots where I can actually introduce these sub-stories. So at this point, I've got the overall story, I know the plot, but I need to figure out, well, how can I use these these real things that have possibly happened to me or to other people to actually drive home the points in my story. So for example, a time when something didn't work out, which is the first section that I bolded, or a time when it did and a project that I worked on and what I learned. And then I just start adding them into the spots where it makes sense. And after this is when I usually start to actually create the presentation. And as I mentioned, this is what I used for my talk and many others. And also, terrible MySQL joke, sorry. Okay, so now that you know how I work, I wanted to also talk about some lessons that I learned. And some of these, as I mentioned, will apply to the overall idea of creating a story with your talk, like creating a plot-driven sort of presentation, and some of these will just apply to sub-story creation. So firstly, you want your stories to be simple. So this presentation is pretty straightforward. It's got like different parts to it, but it's really driving home a singular idea. And I did that on purpose because it's easier for people to follow, and it's more concise when you're not throwing too many things at people, because they're going to lose interest, they're going to be kind of confused, and people can't process a ton of information at once, especially not when you're talking to them for maybe 30 to 45 minutes. They've got a certain amount of things that they can understand, and you have to make sure that you're not presenting too many concepts, otherwise they're not really going to be able to remember all of it. So make sure that your core idea is the one that you're kind of hammering home and talking about as much as you can, and everything that you're presenting is backing up that concept. Secondly, stories should be in low quantity. So what that means is in terms of the overall presentation, again, hopefully you're not making it too complex, but then sub-stories are one of like many different techniques. So me talking about an experience that I've had is one part of this presentation, but I also use things like statements. So I'm stating different things. I'm quoting research, for example. Maybe I ask an audience question, which I'm not doing. But I could also do things like joke, for example, and that's another thing. But if you're overusing any of these techniques, then people are going to recognize them more often, and now you probably all know when I'm going to tell a story. But it's a lot easier when you're presenting about something that's not public speaking or not presentation techniques. And if they start to notice that you're using these techniques and it doesn't feel natural, then they're going to be distracted, and using storytelling as a technique is not going to be beneficial to you. So just make sure that you're thinking about the content of your talk and seeing like, oh, is this story actually necessary in the spot where it is, or am I just trying too hard to throw these things in? Thirdly, you want to make sure that stories that you're telling are relevant. So in terms of the overall concept that you're trying to deliver, ensure that it's relevant for the time period it is in, for example, and it's relevant for the audience that it's being spoken to. So for example, talking about user experience design now is different from 2012, and I have to think about when I'm doing UX design presentations, how things have changed and how I can adapt my presentation to the current time that it lives within. And then in terms of those sub-stories that I'm creating to drive home my concept, I need to make sure that they actually do that, that they're relevant and that they're comprehensible for the audience, that the audience can understand them, basically. And I want to make sure that people who don't know me understand what I'm trying to present, and they find the story relevant. So one way I usually do that is by actually sitting with a bunch of people. Sometimes it's people I know well, sometimes it's coworkers, for example. Sometimes I don't even ask them to sit in front of me. Sometimes I just let them go through my presentation with the notes that I'm going to talk about. And I find that very helpful, because then they can look at it and say, oh, well, I don't understand the point that you're trying to convey. I don't understand how this piece of information you are sharing is relevant to the talk that you're trying to give overall. And then fourthly, stories should be down to earth. So what that means is, again, relatable, human. You want people to remember that you're a human being with feelings and emotions and experiences that got you to where you are. So try not to stay in the high fancy castle, get comfortable laughing at yourself, share times when you've succeeded, but also times when you failed, because lessons about success and failure are equally useful. And for example, one person at a talk that I attended at Beyond Tellerrand described this time where he thought he had a heart attack and kind of wrapped it around this concept of like appreciating life and paying attention to like just being alive a little bit more and kind of taking risks. And I thought it was very interesting because I'm talking about it right now. I still remember it. It really impacted me. And I definitely recommend checking out the Beyond Tellerrand talks from like last year. They were really, really interesting. So see how you can kind of pull in these like life experiences that maybe don't seem very cool or like are like make you seem like a more vulnerable person, because again, they just make you seem and feel more genuine and relatable and down to earth. And then finally, stories should be easy to recall. So just like I did with this person who thought they had a heart attack, takes 5 seconds to talk about what that is. You want to make sure that you're conveying your ideas more effectively. I remember about appreciating life from this presentation this person did because he talked about a heart attack, and that's a very real, relatable thing. I can remember it very easily. And if the listeners don't remember the idea that you were sharing, if they can't attach that concept to the story that you were telling, then you need to figure out a way to make that happen. You have to work on that, improve that technique, and ensure that when you're telling these stories, they are being attached correctly to the idea that you are trying to say to people. So I'm just going to do some wrap up, and then I will share the assignment for this week. I believe it's a week. And so in summary, as I mentioned, storytelling is a very useful way to make your presentation more engaging. Hopefully you enjoyed me talking at you for about half an hour. Listeners also remember stories more because they have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end, and hopefully you can even, when you're creating your presentation, now that you have this idea of the order things are going to go in, you can actually prepare people up front actually to know how the presentation is going to go. And that's just a side note. I found it quite useful to, once I've gotten an idea of the order that my talk is going to go in, actually tell them up front, this is what we're going to talk about today, which is why I did that, and that's because people really like having a little bit of predictability and a little bit of a surprise at the same time. So see if you can kind of utilize this process of designing your content and then figuring out how to organize it into a way that's palatable for people, easy to understand, and then present it to them up front so they know how it's possibly going to end. But then again, it's the process of going through the entire experience. And then again, people relate more to stories because they feel down to earth, they feel familiar. It's things that people may have experienced before or things that people were scared that might actually happen. And both of those provide easier learning lessons for people. And then some advice for, again, designing your talks. I always suggest outlining first before jumping into presentation design. I'm a designer. It's really easy to get stuck making things look nice, but design is a science, so again, not art. But I always suggest outlining first because you want to make sure that your content is going to be easy to process and understand, and then you can actually jump into making it look really cool. When you have both, people really appreciate that. Think about your audience, make sure that you're considering what's going to be useful for them, that the content you're trying to share is going to be something that's relevant and related to the rest of the idea that you're trying to share, and that it's delivered at a level that's comfortable for them. So like make sure that if your audience is going to be more advanced, you can kind of figure out ways to communicate stuff without as many analogies, for example. And then make sure that the sub-stories that kind of drive your plot are, again, relatable, simple, and on topic. So moving on to the assignment, I would like everyone to start telling stories. Yeah. What you're going to do is I'm going to share a link to the public speaking worksheets. I've already given it to Javi, so just got that there. If you can't access a printer, you can just use regular paper for all of these things. That's why it's nice. Their worksheets are just a really extra nice structure for you, but you can also just do it on your own. Whatever works for you is really the thing to do. So ideally you want to start by, once you've identified your idea, and if you haven't, there's a whole extra section for that. But what you want to do is you want to write 4 versions of an abstract. So that's just the process of editing. You've got your initial idea, and then what you'll do is kind of hone in on it until you feel really comfortable by that 4th version that you've created. And then what you're going to do is use the workshop worksheets again to kind of do mind mapping and identify some subtopics that you would want to share in that talk. And then what you're going to do is cut those out. So if you do actually print the worksheets out, it's really fun because you get to do some arts and crafts, which I really personally like a lot. And then you can organize them physically in front of you into an outline. But if you use paper or something else, just rewrite it or just copy and paste until things look good. And then you're going to, if you haven't already, transfer that outline to a writing app like Word or Docs or whatever you like. Pages also is great. And then you can expand upon that outline and add stories from your experience. So really start building that out. And then you will create a basic presentation. You can use a generic template in any of those programs to convey your idea, but really just see how you can use your outline and design it first, and then see how that affects the actual presentation that comes out of the work that you do. So that's pretty much everything I had for today. Hopefully you all found it useful and helpful for the future of your presentation work. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can send me a tweet or an email. I'm available on all of these different things. So thank you.
Testing, testing. All right, great.
Nice.
Thank you so much, Kat. That was absolutely wonderful. We do have some questions, in fact.
Yay.
First, I'd like to ask if we have any questions in the room. Did we have a question on this side of the room? No?
I think we're chill, yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and take some questions from offline then. Kat, can you recommend some talks to watch that are great examples of using storytelling?
Ooh, yes. So as I mentioned, the Beyond Tellerrand Dusseldorf from 2016 had a lot of really great presentations to watch. I'm trying to think of the actual names of some of the presenters, but I would suggest going on Beyond Tellerrand. It's Tellerrand. If you look at, they have a Vimeo account, and they have all of the talks from last year up there, and there are a lot of really great storytellers, including the final keynote talk, who was by a person who talked about designing this incredibly weird Kickstarter book. And I guess he sends out a lot of these insulting illustrations to people just randomly. They pay him to do that, and then he sends them these weird, rude, insulting illustrations. And he talked about the process of turning that into this music video that he did, and I found that to be really cool. They had a bunch of other things like that, where it was this person who made a glass self-driving car that looked really pretty. So there's a lot of these talks at Beyond Tellerrand that are super interesting. AIGA Design Conference also had some really good talks, but I'm not sure when they're going to release them online. That's the only frustrating part, is sometimes finding the actual presentations on the internet can be challenging, but the nice thing is that BTConf has already done that. And I know that Bang Bang Con is also pretty good. A lot of their presentations are also quite great, and I'd definitely suggest watching some of their work.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question from offline. Are you familiar with the pyramid principle? And if so, what are your thoughts about using it to structure your outlines and abstracts?
Ooh, not really completely familiar with it, but I'm definitely curious
So
about
I
what
wasn't
it is.
either,
Yes.
so I did a quick little search, and it appears to be a top-down approach where you first start with your objectives and then find points to support and then fill in details.
Yep,
If
that
I'm saying
sounds
that correctly,
exactly,
I apologize.
Yeah, that's perfect and exactly what I like to do, because you want to start with the overarching idea, then you want to start drilling down a little bit, and then you want to, fill in as much detail as possible, once you've identified the initial objective that you have. So that sounds perfect, and I definitely recommend using that for your design approach.
Great. Thank you so much. Could you quickly provide an example of a sub-story?
Yes, so that's a great question. So you'll notice that during my presentation, I was, so firstly, I designed this entire presentation to sell to you this idea of telling a story with your presentation, but then there were several points during the actual talk that I mentioned, for example, the time that the presenter at another conference talked about having a heart attack or almost having a heart attack, and that was to drive home the concept of making your presentations more relatable or sharing these stories that maybe make you uncomfortable. So that's kind of an example of a sub-story where the overall concept that I'm trying to convey is, hey, you should definitely use storytelling in your talks, and it worked really well for me to design my presentations around this idea of a story. But at the same time, hey, look, here's an example of how it was used really well, like this one concept within the larger presentation. So I hope that helps explain what a sub-story in this case is.
Great. Absolutely, it does. Thank you so much. Here's another question that we've had come in. What are the parameters you use to determine the success of delivering an idea via a story? So what are the feedback parameters that you use?
Yes, so that's a great one. So in terms of the feedback I look for, I firstly look to see that people after the presentation are hopefully positively either sharing information online or come up to me in real life and talk about it. So that's number one, just like ensuring that there's overall success of the presentation. During the presentation, I actually look around to see, like, are people engaged? Do I need to figure out how to add something in that's more interesting to people? So that's another way that I can kind of ensure that there is hopefully an overall success, like a higher success rate. And then I also look to see down the line, do people remember what I was talking about? Because that's the biggest thing, is just making sure that what I was saying was useful for them. And hopefully they'll come up to me and say, oh, like, for example, when I talk about learning to program, hopefully someone will come up afterward and say, hey, I learned to program as a kid too, using this same exact scripting language that I used, like things like that, that really make, like, my whole goal is to make the subject that I'm talking about seem more relatable. And so if it does and people remember these bits and pieces, that's the thing that's most important to me most of the time.
Great, thank you so much. I believe this is for your outline, and I believe you gave us some structure, but the question reads, is there any toolkit which helps in achieving a standard format?
That's a good one. Maybe that's a thing we should all work on together, I would say. Unfortunately, I don't think there is a standard format yet. At Etsy, we're starting to run this internal, I'm helping to run it with a friend who is also a designer there, and it's more of a process of getting designers to do more public speaking, and we're hoping that outline building will become more of a thing. My suggestion in terms of a structure is quite similar to what you may have learned in public school for essay writing, which is you want to have an introduction, and then you want to have maybe 3 or 4 pieces of content in between, and then you want to have a conclusion at the end. And again, it goes back to the beginning, middle, and end that people really like in terms of storytelling. But it's also concise, and it's easy for people to understand. It's easy for all of us as people who are creating this content to figure out how to structure it. Like, I always found it very useful when I was younger to write in that format, because it's very easy to figure out what's my initial statement that I'm trying to talk about, okay, and then how do I back that up, basically, and then how do I conclude that? So that's my suggestion, just kind of going back to primary school. But yeah, that's definitely a thing I think should be worked on, like figuring out more formal frameworks for generating content of this format.
Thank you so much. So one thing you touched on is the power of the presentation itself. Do you encourage using visual cues in your talks and stories? And if so, how do you ensure that they are acceptable when presenting in a different country or culture?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one. So it was definitely challenging in this presentation to figure out how to present the information that I was trying to present. So in this one specifically, there were a ton of words with like embellishments upon them, and that was because I was hoping that it would be easier for the international audience to understand. I definitely do occasionally think about like what do symbols and colors mean in certain places. I feel like I don't really know the answer about pink, but I really like pink, so that's one caveat. But that's why, for example, with this one, it's like it's red, but it also has the cross out symbol, so it's hopeful that people will understand that. And I also did some research into castles around the world to make sure that this would hopefully be somewhat recognizable. So I definitely think that it's useful to visually communicate things, but you want to back that up more with the stuff that you're saying to ensure that the audience understands it, because some people who will look at this won't understand exactly what the heck it's supposed to be, or why I'm using it in this context. So I really try hard to make my slides very simple, and then make sure that the spoken word content is more of what people are focusing on. Although I want to make sure, again, as you can see with like the slide that comes afterward, I use a lot of words, but I use very, very simple statements, and then I just try to explain those. So hopefully that is helpful for this person who's wondering what to do. But yeah, this talk very specifically has a lot of words in it and less imagery, and sometimes I find that useful, like diagrams are a form of like visualization. So I think it's really about figuring out ways to communicate your idea in the best way possible, rather than focusing again on like this technique of should I use lots of images or should I not. It's really about the content that you're trying to communicate to people.
Great, thank you so much. We do have one more question coming in from offline. Question reads, you come from a game developer background. Do you feel there are other things or elements from your background, along with storytelling, that are applicable to public speaking?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think my background in specifically, well, I'm really great at self-deprecation, which is really good for the process of digging in deep and sharing personal experiences that I've had. So I'm really not afraid to like go there, which is really useful. And I think that's definitely because I'm really used to like failing all the time. Like when you're making websites or you're making games, things break so often. And it's really actually humorous sometimes how poorly things work. So it's really nice to be able to like share those experiences with people, and I've got lots of experiences where things didn't work out, which means I have lots of talk fodder, so I've got lots of different things that I can share when I'm talking about something, or just as a presentation idea in general, which is very nice. I'm also very, very organized, partially again because I've gotten used to writing clear and concise programming language or code, which is very nice for listing things out and figuring out, well, how should I communicate this thing in the best way possible, because I very often have to do that for computers and people who will look at my code later. So I really like documenting everything because you never know when you're going to need to come back to it later, and that's actually really great because I very often find myself reusing content from slides, so I make sure to organize my presentations in an easily accessible place. So I have an entire folder on Google Drive where all of my presentations are, and that way if I ever need to reference a slide that I made before, they're all in the same place. So I heavily recommend documenting your presentations well. Writing notes down really, really helps in case you forgot what you were trying to say, and hopefully you use a similar format for all of them, although you honestly can't always control if you're going to have to use Keynote or PowerPoint or Google Drive. Sometimes people have their preferences, but make sure you put everything in an easily accessible place because you never know when you're going to need that again.
Great, thank you so much.
Yay. Any questions in the room?
All right, well, wonderful.
Awesome. Thank
Catt,
all
thank
of
you so much for taking
Thank
the time
you.
to speak with us today.
Of course, happy to be here. So yeah, if you have any remaining questions, you got the information right there, and have a good day / evening wherever all of you are, and thank everyone in the room.
Awesome.
All right.
I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.